Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're tackling some lectures on the Book of Numbers. But these aren't your typical Sunday school summaries. You've given us some excerpts that really dig into the text, and offer some pretty interesting analysis.
Yes. What I find fascinating is that these lectures don't just explain what happened, but they really explore the deeper meaning behind the events, the symbolism, the historical context, and even some intriguing numerical patterns.
Okay, so not just the stories themselves, but like layers of meaning underneath.
Exactly.
Like that numerical analysis angle is really intriguing. Makes you wonder how much deeper meaning is hidden within these stories that we think we're familiar with.
Exactly. And the lecturer does a great job, really, of revealing those hidden layers.
Well, let's unpack some of those layers. Where does this deep dive begin?
Let's start with something you might not expect. The census in the Book of Numbers. It's a detailed account of the Israelite population after they left Egypt. And it's full of interesting details.
Yeah, the census, it's not just a list of names, right? It tells us a story about the Israelites' journey. What do you make of the fact that their numbers actually decrease during those 40 years in the wilderness?
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
It really challenges that assumption that their numbers were just constantly growing, right? The lecturer suggests that this decrease actually speaks to the hardships they faced and the consequences of some of their choices. It's a reminder that even with divine guidance, the path isn't always, easy.
So even being God's chosen people didn't guarantee smooth sailing.
Right, exactly. And the census, it also had a practical purpose. It was the basis for dividing the land of Israel among the tribes. They even used a lottery system, emphasizing that idea of fairness and divine guidance in their society.
A lottery system for land. Wow, that's a different approach than what we're used to.
It is. And there's another interesting detail. The Levites, whose role was to serve in the temple, they were excluded from this land division.
So their service to God was considered their inheritance, in a way.
Exactly. Their purpose was different, focused on, the spiritual well-being of the community.
It makes you think about how we define inheritance today. It's not always about material possessions.
Absolutely. And speaking of the Levites, there's another fascinating aspect of the census that the lecturer points out. The names of the individuals appointed to conduct it.
Okay, I'm curious. What's so special about their names?
Well, the lecture suggests that their names reflect this deep-seated faith and hope that persisted even during their time in Egypt. Names like Pedazur, meaning God saves, and Elishma, meaning my God has heard.
So even when they were facing oppression, their belief in God's salvation remained strong.
Exactly. It speaks volumes about their mindset. Even in difficult times, they clung to hope and believed in a better future. It adds another layer of meaning to the census, beyond just the raw data.
It's amazing how these details, these little things that we might easily overlook, can reveal so much about the people and their beliefs.
Absolutely. And this whole theme of faith and leadership, it really comes to the forefront in the story of Korach's rebellion against Moses and Aaron.
Ah, yes. Korach's rebellion, a classic power struggle.
On the surface, yes. But the lecturer digs a little deeper, suggesting that Korach's motivations, they stemmed from pride and jealousy. Now, Korach wasn't just some power-hungry villain. He was a learned man, well-versed in religious law.
So Korach's story really makes you think about the dangers of knowledge without humility. It seems like his expertise, his knowledge, might have actually fueled his pride. How can we, as individuals, guard against falling into that trap?
That's a great question. The lecture doesn't really offer a simple answer, but suggests that cultivating humility and remembering that knowledge should be used to serve others can help us stay grounded.
So checking our egos, making sure our knowledge is used for good, an important reminder for all of us.
Absolutely. And the lecturer actually draws a fascinating parallel to some events that took place much later during the Second Temple period. There was a room, it was known as the Room of the Money Changers, because high priests were frequently replaced due to corruption.
Wow, so even generations later, they were still struggling with the same issues, pride, power struggles. That's kind of disheartening, isn't it?
It is, but it also underscores, the timelessness of these lessons, the challenges of leadership, the importance of staying true to one's purpose. These are themes that really resonate throughout history.
Speaking of challenges to faith, what about the story of Balak and Balaam? That one always stands out, where a king tries to hire a prophet to curse the Israelites.
Yes, but, it backfires spectacularly. Despite his intentions, Balaam, he finds himself unable to actually curse them. Instead, he can only pronounce blessings.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful testament to God's protection over the Israelites. It seems like even when someone tries to do them harm, it ends up working in their favor.
Exactly. And the blessings that Balaam gives, they actually foreshadow, the future prosperity and achievements of the Israelites. You can see echoes of his words in their later history.
So those blessings weren't just empty words, they held real power.
According to the lecturer, they did. And of course, we can't forget about the talking donkey in that story.
Right. The talking donkey definitely makes you wonder what other surprises are hidden in these texts.
It certainly does. And this unusual event, as the lecturer explains, underscores the power of divine intervention. God can use even the most unexpected means to achieve his purposes and communicate with us.
So maybe we should all be paying more attention to the donkeys in our lives just in case they have something to say.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the Book of Numbers also spends, a considerable amount of time exploring the laws of ritual purity.
The concept of purity was so central to their lives. What kind of details do these lectures highlight?
They really dive into the specifics of the purification process after, coming into contact with a dead body or engaging in warfare. The use of red heifer ashes in these rituals is particularly interesting.
Red heifer ashes, how are they used?
They were mixed with water and sprinkled on those who needed to be cleansed. It was really a key element in restoring spiritual purity and maintaining a right relationship with God.
So it was more than just a physical cleansing, it was about spiritual restoration. What else did these lectures reveal about the importance of purity in their lives?
Well, the lecturer actually shares a fascinating little anecdote about Moses. Even Moses, in a moment of anger, he forgot the laws of purification, emphasizing the point that even the greatest among us are susceptible to human fallibility.
It humanizes him, doesn't it? It shows that even Moses had moments of weakness. Makes me wonder, what can we learn from his mistake?
The lecturer suggests that it's a reminder for all of us to remain calm and rational, especially in challenging situations. Even the most devout can falter when emotions run high.
Yeah. Taking a moment to breathe, to collect yourself before reacting, it can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. And speaking of finding deeper meaning, we can't forget about that whole hidden meaning and symbolism aspect of these lectures. The lecture actually introduces this concept called remez, which means hint in Hebrew. It refers to specific words or phrases that allude to deeper concepts or traditions.
Oh, I love that idea. So, like clues within the text that point to a hidden meaning. Can you give me an example? I'm totally fascinated by this.
There's this really subtle variation in wording in one passage where the word kamishpat is used instead of the more common kamishpatam. This slight change, according to the lecturer, hints at the tradition of pouring water on the altar during the festival of Sukkot.
Wow, that's subtle. I never would have picked up on that.
It takes a keen eye. But these small variations, they can have, big implications. It opens up discussions about the evolution of religious practices and traditions.
It makes you realize how much depth and complexity there is to these ancient texts. There's always more to learn, more to uncover.
Exactly. And this whole idea of hidden meanings, it extends beyond just individual words or phrases, The lecturer also connects seemingly straightforward historical events to broader concepts. For instance, they connect the story of the Israelites traveling around Edom to a prophecy about future exiles and the endurance of the Jewish people.
So their physical journey around Edom becomes a metaphor for their spiritual journey through time. That's quite a leap, but I can see how it adds those layers of meaning.
It does. And it highlights, the lecturer's skill in drawing connections between seemingly unrelated events and finding that deeper significance.
It makes me want to go back and reread those stories with a fresh perspective, really looking for those hidden layers.
That's the beauty of these lectures. They challenge us to really engage with these ancient narratives in new and thought-provoking ways.
This whole Ramez concept, it's like a giant puzzle just waiting to be deciphered. I'm starting to see the appeal of this kind of analysis.
It's not about finding secret codes or anything like that. It's about appreciating the thoughtfulness, the intentionality behind every detail of the text.
And in that process of deciphering, we gain a deeper understanding not only of the text, but also of ourselves and our place in the world, right?
Well said. Now, before we get too lost in the intricacies of biblical numerology and symbolism, maybe we should step back and consider the broader message of these lectures.
Yes, good point. What are the key takeaways for someone who, might not be a biblical scholar? What makes these ancient stories relevant to our lives today?
The lecturer argues that the struggles, the triumphs, and even the mistakes of those who came before us, they hold valuable lessons that we can still apply to our modern lives. Their stories offer timeless wisdom about faith, about leadership, about human nature, and, the importance of our relationship with God.
So even though these stories are thousands of years old, they still speak to us today.
They do. They offer guidance and inspiration for how to live with purpose, how to live with meaning.
That makes a lot of sense. What would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from these lectures so far?
I think it's this idea that these stories aren't just about ancient history, they're about the human experience. They offer insights into our own struggles, our triumphs, and our relationships. They remind us that, we're not alone on this journey.
It's like having a conversation with our ancestors, learning from their wisdom and finding comfort in that shared humanity.
Beautifully put. Now let's dive into some more specific examples of how these lectures bring those ancient lessons to life.
Perfect. I'm ready for more. Okay, so before we went off on that tangent, we were talking about ritual purity. And I think you were about to tell me about the priestly blessings.
Yes. It's fascinating how these ideas about purity extended beyond physical objects and actions. The lecturer talks about those priestly blessings and how they were believed to be more than just words, like a conduit for divine energy to flow into the world.
Oh, wow. So they weren't just nice words. People really believed those blessings carried power.
That's right. And it wasn't just, the average person on the street who believed this. Even Balaam, the prophet who was hired to curse the Israelites but ended up blessing them, instead he recognized the power of those priestly blessings. The lecturer points out that Balaam actually wished to die the death of the righteous, a death that, according to their beliefs, was accompanied by those blessings.
That's amazing. So even someone who initially sought to harm the Israelites acknowledged the profound spiritual power associated with those blessings.
It really speaks to their potency, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the lecturer connects this idea of spiritual focus to the physical layout of the tabernacle.
What do you mean? How could a building reflect spiritual focus?
Well, remember those instructions about how Aaron was supposed to light the lamps in the tabernacle? It seemed like a weirdly specific detail at the time. God told him to make sure they all faced toward the center.
Uh-huh. I remember thinking, why is that so important?
Right. But the lecturer suggests that it wasn't just about, practically illuminating the space. It was about symbolism, about creating this visual representation of the Israelites' collective orientation towards God.
So it's like even their physical surroundings were intentionally designed to reflect their spiritual aspirations.
Exactly. It was about infusing their space with meaning. Which makes me wonder, how can we do that in our own lives? How can we design spaces that reflect our values and aspirations?
It is something to think about. I mean, we could rearrange furniture to create a sense of focus or bring objects that hold meaning for us into our homes or workspaces. Okay, so getting back to the lectures, you mentioned that the story of Korach's rebellion kept coming up. What's so important about that story?
The lecturer seems to use it as a cautionary tale about what can go wrong when good intentions get derailed by pride and ambition.
It's easy to see Korach as just a villain, but as we've discussed, he was actually a learned man, very knowledgeable in religious law.
And that's what makes it so tragic. The lecturer seems to suggest that his knowledge and status might have actually contributed to his downfall. Like he had all this expertise, but he lacked the humility to wield it wisely.
So it's not just a lack of knowledge that can lead us astray, but also a lack of humility. It makes you think about the ways we use our own knowledge and expertise, doesn't it?
It really does. How do we ensure that our knowledge doesn't become a source of arrogance, but a tool for serving others and making a positive impact on the world?
It's a question worth pondering. Speaking of seeking wise counsel, the lecturer also talks about how Moses appointed judges to help him govern the Israelites. That was a smart move, right? Delegation of authority, it's leadership 101.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is how intentional Moses was about it. The lecturer points out that he didn't just randomly pick people. He prayed for guidance and then carefully selected 70 elders who were known for their wisdom and integrity.
So it was about discernment, making sure he chose the right people for the job. But you mentioned there was a bit of a dilemma with this whole process. What was it?
Well, each of the 12 tribes was supposed to have equal representation among those 70 elders. But 70 doesn't divide evenly by 12.
Yes. The classic math problem turned political dilemma. So how did Moses solve that?
He resorted to a familiar method, writing the names of all potential candidates on slips of paper, and then casting lots to determine who would be chosen.
the old lottery system. So chance played a role even in this very important decision of selecting leaders. I guess that's another example of how they blended human wisdom with divine guidance.
It really is. And speaking of blending human wisdom with divine guidance, I want to hear more about those subtle hints hidden in the text that the lecturer calls remez.
Oh, yes. Those little clues that point to a deeper meaning. What other examples did the lecturer give?
One that stands out involves those offerings that the tribal leaders brought when the tabernacle was dedicated. They all brought gifts, right?
Right. And the lecturer pointed out that there was a subtle difference in the way one of the leaders' actions were described compared to the others.
Exactly. For 11 of the leaders, the text says, Vayas kosher asher tziva Adonai et Moshe, which means, and he did as the Lord commanded Moses.
So it's basically saying that they were following God's instructions. What about the 12th leader?
For the 12th leader, the phrase is slightly different. It says, Vayas kuchal asher tziva Moshe, which means, and he did as Moses commanded. The reference to God's command is omitted.
Wow, that is subtle. What does the lecturer make of that little change?
They suggest it's a remez, a hint that points to a debate that existed among the rabbis about the origins of certain rituals.
So this one tiny variation in wording opens up a whole discussion about the evolution of religious practices.
Exactly. And the lecturer gives other examples of these remez that connect seemingly unrelated events or ideas. Remember how we talked about how they connect the story of the Israelites going around Edom with the idea of exile?
Yeah, the physical journey around Edom becomes a metaphor for their spiritual journey and even foreshadows the exile that would come later.
It's amazing how those multiple layers of meaning can be woven into these historical accounts.
It really is. And I love how the lecturer dives into the details of the route they took through the wilderness. I mean, at first glance, those travelogues seem pretty boring, just a list of places. But the lecturer finds so much meaning in those details.
They really do. They suggest those travelogues are like a metaphor for the spiritual journey of the Israelites.
Yeah.
Each stop they made represents a stage in their development.
So it's about more than just the geography. It's about where they were spiritually at each point in their journey.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how even the names of those places often have symbolic meaning. One example is a place called Kibroth Hatava.
Kibroth Hatava. That's a mouthful. What does it mean?
It means the graves of craving. And it's a fitting name because it was the place where the Israelites got tired of manna and started complaining about wanting meat.
So it's associated with those moments of dissatisfaction, longing for what they didn't have, forgetting about what God had already provided. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
It's a human experience that transcends time and culture, isn't it? The lecturer uses that story to highlight the danger of getting caught up in those cravings, letting those desires control us. True satisfaction comes from aligning ourselves with God's will, not from indulging every passing whim.
That's a lesson that's very relevant to our modern lives. We're constantly bombarded with messages telling us we need more, more, more. It's easy to get caught in that cycle of craving.
And it's rarely fulfilling, is it? But that's not the only place with a symbolic name. Another stop in their journey was a place called Mara.
Mara, which means
It means bitter.
bitter. I'm sensing a theme here with these place names.
It makes sense, right? Because at Mara, the Israelites encountered bitter water. Of course, they complained. Again,
So another instance of hardship and discontent. But wasn't there also a miracle at Mara?
yes, God provides a solution. He instructs Moses to throw a piece of wood into the water, and it miraculously becomes sweet.
So even in a place called bitter, there's the possibility of transformation and sweetness. What a great reminder that God can work even in the midst of difficult circumstances to bring about positive change.
It really is. It reminds us that even when things seem bleak, there's always hope, and that God can use even the most unexpected means to bring about healing and transformation.
These travel logs are starting to sound less like boring lists and more like these profound spiritual metaphors.
That's what's so amazing about studying these texts. There's always more to uncover. The lecturer does such a great job of helping us see those deeper layers of meaning.
So after all this traveling and all those challenges, the Israelites eventually emerged victorious from their battles. What do these lectures have to say about the division of spoils? Was it just every man for himself?
Not at all. The lecturer emphasizes that even in the midst of victory, fairness and divine guidance were paramount. A portion of the spoils was set aside as a tribute to God, and the rest was divided equally between the soldiers and the community.
So there was a system in place, even in victory, to make sure everyone benefited. It wasn't just a free-for-all.
Right. And to make sure it was truly fair, Moses was instructed to take a census before the distribution of spoils. This way, everyone received a share based on how much they participated in the battle.
Makes sense. That would help prevent any disputes later on.
Exactly. And there's another interesting detail. The spoils were actually divided into two portions, one for the soldiers who fought and one for the rest of the community.
Why two portions? Why not just divide it all up equally among everyone?
Well, it was their way of recognizing that victory is often the result of a collective effort, not just the actions of those on the front lines. The people who remained at home, providing support and keeping things running, they also contributed to the victory.
I like that. It emphasizes that we all have different roles to play, and that even those who aren't directly involved in the fight can still make important contributions.
Exactly. And of course, a portion was also set aside for the Levites, who, as we've discussed, played a special role in their society.
Right. Their service to God was their inheritance. It's interesting how the lecturer keeps bringing up this theme of taking care of those who are dedicated to serving the community. It seems like a value we could learn from in our modern world, don't you think?
I agree. It's a good reminder to think about how we value and support those who are dedicated to serving others. Now, we've talked about the seriousness of making vows, but what about the kinds of vows people made?
Yes, I'm curious about that. What were they promising?
The lecturer explains that people made vows for all sorts of reasons, to express gratitude, to ask God for something, to dedicate themselves to a particular cause, or to make amends for something they'd done wrong.
So it was a way to formalize their commitment to something, making it more official and binding. But you mentioned that there were also provisions for annulment. So it wasn't like you were stuck with a vow forever.
Right, there were circumstances under which a vow could be annulled. But the process wasn't simple. The lecturer points out that it involved consulting with a priest or some other authority figure, showing that they didn't take this lightly.
It reminds us that our words matter. Making a vow wasn't something you did on a whim.
Absolutely. It was a serious commitment. Now, speaking of challenging norms and seeking justice, the lecturer tells a fascinating story about Zelophehad's daughters.
Zelophehad's daughters. Refresh my memory. Who were they?
Zelophehad was a man who died without any sons. His daughters were worried about their inheritance, because at that time, inheritance usually went to the male heirs. So they went to Moses to appeal for a solution.
So they were facing this legal challenge because the existing laws didn't really address their situation. What happened?
Well, it's interesting because their appeal itself was significant. It shows that even within a patriarchal system, there was still room for seeking justice and challenging norms. And Moses, to his credit, took their case seriously.
So he didn't just dismiss them.
No, he took their case to God, who ultimately ruled in their favor. Zelophehad's daughters were granted the right to inherit their father's land, which actually set a legal precedent for cases involving female heirs in the future.
Wow, so they actually changed the law. That's a powerful reminder that sometimes it takes the courage of a few to change the system and create a more just world.
It really is. It shows that change is possible, even within systems that seem very rigid.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and revisit one of those stories that always makes me smile. Balaam and the talking donkey.
Ah, yes, the talking donkey. It definitely makes you wonder what other surprises are hidden in these texts.
It's one of those stories that everyone remembers, but I've always wondered about the deeper meaning behind it. Is it just a funny story, or is there more to it?
The lecturer definitely sees more to it. They suggest that the talking donkey represents divine intervention, a reminder that God can use even the most unexpected methods to communicate with us.
It is funny, because we often use the phrase talking donkey to describe something that's ridiculous or unbelievable, but in this case, it's actually a sign of something profound.
Exactly. It's a reminder to be open to those unexpected sources of wisdom and guidance, and to pay attention to the signs and messages that we're given, because sometimes they come from the most unlikely places.
It's like that saying, if you don't listen to your gut, you'll end up talking to your butt. Or in this case, listening to your donkey.
That's a good one. But the lecturer also draws a connection between this story and the concept of free will. It might seem like a strange connection at first, but...
Free will and a talking donkey. I'm not seeing the connection.
Well, the lecturer suggests that the fact that the donkey can speak represents God's willingness to intervene in human affairs. But ultimately, the choice of how to respond is up to the individual. Remember how Balaam ignored those warnings from the donkey at first? He chose to follow his own path, which ultimately led to more problems.
So God might guide us, but we still have the freedom to choose and to face the consequences of our choices.
Exactly. It's about the interplay of divine guidance and human agency. Now, another topic we touched on earlier was the ritual of the red heifer. The lecture goes into a lot of detail about this ritual, which, as you mentioned, was used to cleanse people who had become ritually impure.
Right. The ashes of a red heifer were used in the purification process. But I remember you said there was something paradoxical about this ritual.
That's right. The red heifer was seen as both a source of purity and a reminder of death, which might seem counterintuitive.
Yeah, I don't really see how those two things go together.
Well, the heifer was burned outside the camp, and its ashes were used specifically to cleanse those who had come into contact with the dead body. So it was connected to death and impurity on the one hand, but also used to restore purity on the other.
It's like the idea that sometimes to become truly pure or whole, we have to confront those darker aspects of life, death, impurity, the things that make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. And the lecturer also points out how meticulously this ritual was performed. Every detail, from the choice of the animal to how it was prepared, had to be done exactly right.
Why so much emphasis on precision?
Well, the lecturer suggests it underscores the importance of mindfulness. It's not just about going through the motions, but really being present and aware of the meaning and purpose behind these actions.
So it's not just blindly following the rules, it's about bringing intention and awareness to the process. It's like the outward actions reflect an inner state.
Right. And the lecturer also connects the red heifer ritual to the idea of atonement.
Atonement. I'm curious about that connection. How does a purification ritual relate to the idea of atonement?
Well, remember, the red heifer was sacrificed outside the camp, and its ashes were used to cleanse those who were impure. The lecturer suggests that this ritual foreshadows the ultimate sacrifice, the sacrifice of Jesus.
So they're saying that there's a parallel between the purification offered by the red heifer and the redemption offered through Jesus.
Exactly. Both point to a deeper truth about the need for sacrifice and atonement to restore our relationship with God.
That's a powerful connection. And it makes you think about how the concept of atonement continues to resonate throughout history and across different cultures. It's a universal human need, isn't it? To make things right, to seek forgiveness, to find healing.
It really is. Now, as the lectures draw to a close, they shift focus to a pivotal moment in the Israelites' journey, the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua.
Ah, yes, the passing of the torch. A big moment for any organization, especially one that's been led by the same person for so long.
It really is. And the lecturer highlights this transition as a model for successful succession planning and the peaceful transfer of power. It's a fascinating case study in leadership.
So what made it so successful?
Well, for starters, it wasn't just a random decision. God specifically instructed Moses to appoint Joshua, and then Moses publicly affirmed Joshua's leadership in front of everyone. There was also a transfer of God's Spirit to Joshua.
So divine mandate, public endorsement, and spiritual empowerment. Sound like they really covered all the bases.
They did. And the lecturer also points out the humility and obedience demonstrated by both Moses and Joshua throughout this whole process. I mean, Moses had been their leader for so long, yet he willingly stepped aside when God told him it was time. And Joshua, despite some initial hesitation, accepted the role with humility.
It's a beautiful example of leadership that's not about clinging to power, but about serving something greater.
Well said. And that brings us to the lecturer's final reflections on the overall message of the Book of Numbers.
Okay, I'm ready for the grand finale. What are the big takeaways?
Well, the lecturer emphasizes that the Book of Numbers is more than just a historical account, or even a collection of laws and rules. It's ultimately a story about God's faithfulness, His guidance, and His love for His people.
It's a reminder that God is with us even when we're going through tough times, even when we mess up.
Exactly. And the lecturer really stresses how important it is to learn from those who came before us, to learn from their mistakes. I mean, the Israelites were God's chosen people, but they mess up a lot. They complained, they disobeyed, and they faced consequences for their actions.
So their story is a cautionary tale, but also one that offers hope. We can learn from their mistakes, and we can see how God was faithful to them even when they weren't faithful to Him.
Right. And the lecturer also highlights the importance of community and the power of unity. Despite their internal struggles, the Israelites were bound together by their covenant with God and their shared destiny.
It's a good reminder that we're stronger together and that community can be a powerful source of support and strength, especially in the face of challenges.
Absolutely. And finally, the lecturer reminds us that the Book of Numbers isn't just about the past. It points us toward a future hope, the coming of the Messiah, who will ultimately fulfill God's promises to his people.
So it's a story that, in a way, is still unfolding.
Exactly. It's a story of faith, of struggle, of resilience, and ultimately of hope. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive.
What an incredible journey. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, though. There's so much richness and depth to these ancient texts.
There really is. It's amazing how much wisdom and insight they offer, even thousands of years later.
It's been such a pleasure exploring these lectures with you. But before we sign off, let's leave our listeners with something to ponder.
If the seemingly mundane details of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness can hold such profound meaning, what hidden significance might be woven into your own life story? What seemingly insignificant events might reveal a deeper purpose, a greater plan? It's something to think about as you continue on your own journey.
That's a beautiful thought. It's a reminder to pay attention to the details, to look for the meaning in the everyday moments, and to trust that even in the midst of our own wilderness wanderings, God is with us, guiding us towards a greater purpose. So before we got sidetracked there, you were going to tell me more about the laws regarding intermarriage and, the consequences for those who broke them.
Right. It's definitely a topic that needs to be approached carefully. It's important to remember the historical and cultural context. These laws were given at a time when the Israelites were a relatively small group surrounded by other cultures with very different beliefs and practices.
So it was about maintaining their identity, their way of life, in the face of potential assimilation.
That's a key point, yes.
Yeah.
The lecture emphasizes that these laws were really about preserving their distinct cultural and religious practices, which were deeply intertwined with their sense of community and their covenant with God.
It makes you think about how those same concerns might manifest in different ways today, especially in our increasingly globalized world where cultures are constantly interacting and influencing each other.
Absolutely. It's a timeless challenge, isn't it? The specifics might change, but the underlying themes of identity, belonging, and preserving traditions in a rapidly changing world, those remain relevant.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the lecturer discusses the roles and responsibilities of the different tribes. It wasn't just a random division of land, was it?
No, not at all. The lecture really highlights the intentionality behind it. Each tribe had its own unique purpose and contribution to the community as a whole, based on, their strengths, their skills, their history.
So it was about recognizing the diverse gifts within the community and utilizing them for the common good.
Exactly. It was a system designed to maximize their collective potential. You had the tribe of Levi dedicated to the spiritual well-being of the nation, while other tribes focused on, things like agriculture, defense, craftsmanship, each playing a vital role.
It's like that analogy the lecturer used, comparing the tribes to different parts of the human body.
Yes, each tribe was essential, like an organ,
Mm-hmm.
Just as the body needs all its parts to function properly, the nation of Israel needed each tribe to fulfill its unique role.
A beautiful illustration of unity and diversity. And speaking of unity, I remember you mentioning the symbolic significance of their camping formation in the wilderness. How was that a reflection of their beliefs and relationships?
The way they arranged their tents, it wasn't just about logistics, It was a visual representation of the relationship with God and with one another. At the very center of the camp was the tabernacle, housing the Ark of the Covenant.
So literally placing the most sacred space at the heart of their community.
Exactly. And surrounding the tabernacle were the tents of the Levites, those responsible for its care and service.
So those dedicated to serving God were closest to the symbol of his presence.
Exactly. A physical manifestation of their spiritual proximity. And then beyond the Levites, you had the camps of the 12 tribes, arranged in a specific order based on their genealogical connections.
Their physical location reflecting their family ties.
Precisely. The lecture suggests that this, highlights the importance of both spiritual and familial bonds in their society. It was a way of weaving those connections into the very fabric of their lives.
It's amazing how intentional they were about every aspect of their existence. Nothing was arbitrary. Everything had a deeper meaning.
Right. And regardless of where a tribe was situated, they were always oriented towards the tabernacle, symbolizing a shared focus on God's presence amidst their diversity.
A beautiful image of unity. You mentioned before that each tribe also had its own flag or banner. What did those symbolize?
It's fascinating, actually. The details of the banners aren't explicitly described in the text, so the lecturer draws on rabbinic tradition and commentary. They suggest that these banners serve multiple purposes, markers of tribal identity, symbols of national unity, and reminders of each tribe's unique role and responsibility.
So much more than just decorative flags. What were some of the symbols they used?
Well, for example, the tribe of Judah, known for its leadership and strength, was often associated with a lion as its emblem.
A lion. Makes sense. A symbol of power and royalty.
Right. And the tribe of Ephraim, known for its fertility and abundance, was often associated with a bull or an ox, symbols of agricultural prosperity.
I love that each tribe had a symbol that captured its essence. Now, I know this is a tough topic, but the lecturer also discusses the laws regarding warfare, right? How do they approach such a sensitive subject?
Very carefully, as you might imagine. They acknowledge the complexities and sensitivities of it, emphasizing the importance of understanding those laws within their historical and cultural context.
So it's not about, condoning violence or glorifying war, but rather exploring how the Israelites approach this unavoidable aspect of their reality.
Exactly. The focus is on the ethical and legal frameworks
Yeah.
that, guided their actions in those situations.
So even in the midst of war, there were rules, boundaries.
Absolutely. They had specific rules of engagement, guidelines for the treatment of prisoners, and a system for dividing spoils. The lecture points out that these rules were designed to, mitigate the brutality of war and ensure a more just outcome.
It's interesting, that idea that even in such a chaotic and violent situation, there was an attempt to impose order and maintain a sense of justice.
Right. And they weren't just empty rules either. The lecture emphasizes that these laws reflected a deeper ethical principle. Even in war, there are limits. Compassion and justice still matter.
A message that certainly resonates today. Speaking of compassion and justice, you mentioned earlier the cities of refuge. What were those exactly?
They were cities designated as safe havens for individuals who had accidentally killed someone.
So not for intentional murder, but in cases of unintentional manslaughter.
Precisely. It was a recognition that, tragic accidents can happen. The lecture explains that these cities serve to prevent cycles of revenge killings and ensure a fair process for determining guilt or innocence.
So it was a way to protect both the victim's family and the person who had caused the death, acknowledging the need for both accountability and mercy.
Exactly. And the lecturer also points out that these cities were more than just, physical locations. They were also seen as representing God's grace and forgiveness.
A spiritual refuge as well as a physical one.
Yes. They symbolize that even when we make mistakes, there's a place of safety and a path to redemption. Now, as these lectures come to an end, the lecture focuses on that pivotal moment when Moses hands over leadership to Joshua.
The passing of the torch. A significant moment for sure, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another.
It is. And the lecture presents it as a model for successful succession planning and a peaceful transfer of power. God instructed Moses to appoint Joshua, and then Moses publicly confirmed Joshua's leadership. There was also a transfer of God's spirit to Joshua.
Divine mandate, public affirmation, and spiritual empowerment. They really thought of everything.
They did. And the lecture points out that throughout this process, both Moses and Joshua demonstrated humility and obedience. Moses, despite his long tenure as leader, willingly stepped aside when God said it was time. And Joshua, though initially hesitant, humbly accepted the responsibility.
It's a beautiful example of servant leadership, putting the needs of the community above personal ambition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, the lecture offers some final reflections on the message and significance of the Book of Numbers as a whole.
Okay, I'm eager to hear their concluding thoughts. What are the key takeaways?
Well, they emphasize that the Book of Numbers is not just some ancient history book or a dry collection of laws. It's a story about God's faithfulness and love for his people, even in the face of their shortcomings and their failures.
A reminder that God's love is constant, unwavering.
Exactly. And the lecture also highlights the importance of learning from those who came before us, learning from their mistakes. The Israelites, despite being God's chosen people, made plenty of mistakes. Their story serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that actions have consequences.
But also a reminder that we don't have to make the same mistakes, right? We can learn from their experiences.
Exactly. And just as important is the message of community. The Israelites, despite their internal conflicts and challenges, were united by their covenant with God and their shared purpose.
The power of shared purpose, shared values, to bring people together. It's something we could all use a little more of today.
Couldn't agree more. And finally, the lecture reminds us that the Book of Numbers points us toward something greater. It points toward the hope of the Messiah, who will ultimately fulfill God's promises.
A beautiful message of hope. It reminds us that our journey here is just one part of a much larger story, a story that ultimately ends in redemption and fulfillment.
Yes. And with that inspiring thought, we come to the end of our deep dive into the Book of Numbers.
It's been an incredible journey. We've explored complex laws and rituals, uncovered hidden meanings, and discovered timeless wisdom that speaks to our lives today.
We've learned about leadership, faith, human nature, and that deep longing within each of us for connection, for purpose, for something greater than ourselves.
It's been a privilege to explore these profound ideas with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. And until next time, may your own journey be filled with curiosity, exploration, and the discovery of those hidden treasures of wisdom and meaning